This conference will now be recorded.
Very good evening to one and all present here. I, Bharti Satnani, on behalf of Biosetup Lifesciences, take this honor to welcome our founder coordinator, Aragya Deep Das Sir, our resource person, Dr. Victoria Sherwood, faculty members, dear students, please turn off your mic.
This conference will now be recorded.
I welcome you all, our founder coordinator, Aragya Deep Das Sir, our resource person, Dr. Victoria Sherwood, faculty members, organizers, event coordinators, Dr. Kavita Pal, Dr. Sudeep Das, Dr. Arpana Parihar, Dr. Ritu S. Shandal, Mrs. Somoju Bargavi, and all my dear participants. I welcome you all to the webinar on Careers in Medical Communications organized by Biosetup Lifesciences. Let me start by introducing our organization, Biosetup Lifesciences. Biosetup Lifesciences is a hub for scientific research and learning approved by ISO 9001-2015 certified and MSME Government of India registered organization having a multidisciplinary team of faculty and research associates that provide support to aspiring students in life sciences. We have successfully organized many workshops, certification courses, career counseling, and competitive exam preparation, such as CSIR, IIT-JAM, GAT-B, IISc, and DBT. We are continuously working for the career upgradation of the students. Now, without further ado, let me also introduce you to our today's resource person, Dr. Victoria Sherwood ma'am. Dr. Victoria Sherwood ma'am is a scientific writing team lead at Novartis in London, UK. Before transitioning to the pharmaceutical industry, ma'am was a principal investigator running a skin cancer research lab at the University of Dundee, UK. In her current role at Novartis, ma'am leads a team of writers who produce medical communication that disseminate the results of clinical trials, real-world evidence, and clinical opinions to the medical and scientific community. Her work supports Novartis to effectively communicate clinical research findings from their oncology pipeline and across brands. NAM also supports STEM professionals secure meaningful work outside academia through her website www.biomedbadass.com. She helps academic researchers under the non-academic job market identify careers that align with their values and skills, network productively, prepare applications that get noticed, and interview effectively for private sector jobs with a specialty in the pharma industry. This was all about the ma'am's introduction. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. Please do not share your audio, video, or screen to avoid any kind of disturbance. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat box. I'll bring them up after the presentation, and we will also have time for the discussion at the end. Now, I request ma'am to kindly proceed. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the kind introduction. I'm really grateful to the organisers for this. I relish any opportunity to talk about medical communications and careers in medical communications, because it really is the hidden gem of the pharma industry for anybody who enjoys clinical research, who wants flexible working, who wants to, earn a good wage, and maybe wants to move away from the lab bench. So this talk will be for you if those things kind of appeal to you. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to try and talk about what medical communications actually is and explain it to you, to try and see if it's something that would be of interest to you. Then I'm going to try and describe what it's like to work in the world of medical communications and in the pharma industry itself, and give you a few tips on how to break into this area, this career, if it sounds of interest. But first, I'd just like to set some context of the world in which we're working in pharma and the current challenges that we face. And I just want to say before, just a quick disclaimer before I move on, I'm talking here today as myself, as a STEM's career blogger, somebody who's written about STEM careers since 2018, not really as a Novartis representative. These are all my own thoughts. Okay, so we're currently working in a very highly changing and evolving healthcare landscape. And this is because the world's population is growing by about 83 million people annually, which is an absolutely astonishingly huge figure. It's rapid growth and it's changing the healthcare landscape for the future. And of course, this is important to the pharma industry because the healthcare landscape, the healthcare industry, is where the pharmaceutical industry operates. It's where it sells its products. So how this is affected by this increase in global population affects how we do business as the pharma industry. So we know we've got this rising population. We'll have 1 billion more people by 2025. And it's not necessarily driven by higher birth rates, but rather in the large part driven by a rapidly aging population. The life expectancy or projected life expectancy in 2050 is going to be over 77 years old. If we think about 100 years ago, 1950, does anybody know what the life expectancy was globally in 1950? If anybody wants to stick that in the chat and have a guess, please go for it. I'll tell you the answer before you have a chance to Google it. But if anybody wants to hazard a guess what the life expectancy was in 1950, please be brave enough to stick it in the chat, because it's quite interesting to see how it's changed in 100 years. 1940, 40's getting closer, 70. Okay, some good. In India, it's around 47. Okay, yeah. So the global, yes, average. Suchita, you got it right. It's 50 years. Okay, so in 100 years, we have achieved an increase in life expectancy by 27 years, which is a fantastic achievement. And we've done this by increasing healthcare access, and by understanding disease, the mechanisms of disease, and really tackling it head on. So it's a fantastic achievement. What it's actually meant is that because we have this rapidly aging population, we've got this huge increase in chronic disease burden. So with these older people in our population, it's predicted by 2025 that 70% of all illnesses will be chronic, and we will need to treat some of these. Now, unlike infectious diseases where we have good cures, as we've seen with the pandemic, we can manufacture vaccines quickly as needed. We've got antibiotics, at least they're effective at the minute, although that could cause a problem going forward. But we can't really cure chronic disease. We can treat chronic disease, we can treat the symptoms of it. If we take diabetes, for example, we can't really cure diabetes, it's type 1, but we can treat the symptoms of sugar levels and managing insulin levels. So we can treat symptoms, but we can't really cure. So there's a lot of burden on healthcare providers to be able to treat these chronic diseases in a rapidly aging and growing population. And so what we're seeing is that healthcare costs are absolutely spiraling out of control. There's a 5% increase annual in healthcare costs predicted over the next 2 to 3 years. That's completely unsustainable. Governments and insurance companies cannot keep providing that level of increased costs. So as a society, as a global society and global community, we have to think about the way in which we can deal with these things. But what it means for the pharma industry right now with these rapid healthcare costs, rising healthcare costs, is that it's creating a very challenging marketplace for pharma companies to operate in, because they're going to have to get increasingly sharp at highlighting and communicating the value of their technologies for the patients that they treat. People want to know what the cost-benefit ratio is of those drugs that they're going to purchase for the end user, for the patient. And so pharma companies are taking this very seriously. And one thing that they're doing is employing professionals to be able to handle these communications. They want to be able to communicate with an array of stakeholders in healthcare. These include the general public, payers, as I said, governments, insurance companies, healthcare professionals, the physicians that are actually treating the patients, patients themselves, and the regulatory bodies that are providing the licenses for those drugs to enter the marketplace. Pharma companies need to be able to communicate exactly what the value is of the technologies that they're producing for all of these stakeholders within healthcare. Coupled on top of that, how you communicate to these different stakeholders needs to be handled in a very compliant manner. And I'll get onto compliance in a minute, because it's one of the most heavily regulated industries in the world, the pharma industry, for a good reason, which is all about patient safety. But when we communicate with these people, we have to be transparent, we have to do it in a balanced way, we have to give the risks versus the benefits of every drug, we have to report all the science, and we have to document all of this as well. How we interact with these people, how we communicate with them, and the feedback that we get from them about the drugs we're using, whether they're effective, whether they're safe, all needs to be documented in an audit trail. Because if the regulatory authorities were to come and ask, did anybody ever raise a concern? Was that safety indication early on in the development of that product? Then we need to be able to pull up that information and show it straight away. So this increased importance of being able to communicate with stakeholders in healthcare and having this extra level of regulation laid on top with how we do these communications means that the demand for communication professionals in pharma has actually never been higher than it is right now. And it doesn't look to be slowing down. So they're looking for people who have a STEM background, who can understand the clinical trial data, who can communicate it clearly and effectively. Pharma companies are looking for folks that have an interest in scientific writing and in scientific communications generally. So if you want to get into this industry, this is a great time to do it. So I thought I'd just quickly highlight who I am and why I know a little bit about medical communications. So I've worked in medcoms for about the last 5 or so years. It's more than 5 years, I'm probably about 5.5 now. I'm currently a manager at Novartis of a team of scientific writers, and they write specifically in oncology across the entire portfolio of oncology products that Novartis produce, from early pipeline development drugs through to mature brands. Prior to that, I was a writer myself. I've worked in pharma as a writer, I've worked as a freelancer, I've worked for myself, and I've worked for bespoke medical communications agencies as well. There's lots of employers, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on in the talk. But before that, I had this long career in academia. And it culminated really in running my own research group, as was said at the beginning. But it dawned on me at some point, I actually liked talking about science. I liked going to the congresses, talking about the research, putting the slides together, writing up the papers. I actually preferred the communication side of what we were doing rather than the actual research itself. And that's when I decided I was going to change careers and become a medical communications professional. So what exactly is medical communications? I get asked this a lot for people who don't really know about this area of work. And it's not actually that easy to define, because actually what it is, it's an arm of marketing in a way. So it's marketing, but it's not marketing in the kind of standard advertising or media coverage that you might think of as standard marketing. It's marketing in as much as we're talking about the science behind the technology that the pharma company is producing. And we're highlighting the importance of that science and that technology and what it can do for patients. And also, again, as I said, being transparent and showing any risks around using a particular medication as well. So in summary, I've tried to define it here as a strategic communications approach that conveys a consistent, clear and compelling message to help the biopharma companies manage their products through their entire life cycle. So that sounds very wordy, but actually it just means what I said. It's about communicating the science behind the technology that the pharma companies are producing. So what do I mean by product life cycle? So I've tried to summarize it here in this graph. Basically, we know that there's a long lead-in time in the development of any drug. You've got to go through the preclinical and the clinical research to be able to show to the agencies the FDA and the EMA, or whichever agency it is that regulates drugs and gives out licenses for selling drugs in particular geographical regions, you've got to be able to show that the product is effective and it's safe, and it's effective above the the current standard of care, or at least it may be as effective but with less side effects. Okay, so it has to stand up against that kind of rigor, against that analysis. And that's what pharma companies are doing in a phase 3 trial. They're testing their new products against what's the current standard of care or a placebo. And they're showing the regulators that that drug works. If it does, they will receive a license. That solid line there is showing where you might receive a license. Once you've received a license, you can actually go and sell that product in a marketplace. So at that point, you can start to recoup your initial investment in the drug development phase and start to increase your sales over time. So most drugs follow this kind of classic bell-shaped curve in their product life cycle during the sales phase. Once they've reached maturity and they start to reach that patent cliff, so after about 20 years, the pharma company will be able to exclusively sell their new technology. But after that, generics will be able to enter the market, and at that point, sales will start to decline. So why is this important to anybody involved in medical communications? And the key is that how we talk about drugs in that early pre-license phase is very different to how we would talk about drugs after you've received the license. And again, how you would talk about drugs, whether they're a mature drug or you're just at the stage of launch, is very different again. But there's a very key critical difference between the communications you can produce for a drug that's still in development versus one that's licensed and you're able to sell. So obviously, when it's in development, you haven't got a license, you can't sell it. So none of the communications you can do can be perceived by the regulatory authorities as being promotional. All communications in this phase, in the product pipeline, early product pipeline, has to be non-promotional. At the point of receiving your license, as I said, you can sell. You can then talk about that drug in a promotional manner, but you can only do it for the target population that's written in the label. Okay, so when you did your phase 3 study in a particular patient cohort and you showed it worked, you can sell that drug to that particular set of patients. You can't sell it to another set of patients for a different indication or a different age or whatever wasn't covered in the clinical trial. So you can produce communications that are promotional, but only promotional for that on-label, as we would describe it, on-label product. So you can also talk about things in a non-promotional manner as well. Maybe you want to think about how a drug may be able to support a different set of patients that aren't on the label. So you can have both non-promotional and promotional materials produced during the marketable phase of product development. So as I said, all communications here would be described as off-label. There is no label provided. After this point, you can have on-label and off-label discussions with stakeholders in healthcare. We talk about this as being the product pipeline. And after this point, we're talking about brands. Okay, so I hope that's clear that it's very important to the communications professionals that they understand this distinction and that they're fully aware of the materials that they produce will comply with this. So I'm getting back to this point of compliance because it's very, very important for the pharmaceutical industry. And it's one of the key differences that I found as a scientist, moving away from talking about my science in an academic context to talking about medical science in the pharma industry, because you have to do so, as I said, in this compliant manner. If we think about some of the key things that the pharma industry has to be compliant about, it can't pay physicians, okay, it can't give bonuses or kickbacks, as it's referred to physicians to promote their products. That has been illegal for a long time, ever since the US initiated the Sunshine Act decades ago. So we cannot be perceived to pay physicians to promote particular drugs. We've got to show patient anonymity. Remember, we're using patients in the clinical trials development phase to show that products work, that show that those drugs will work. And we need to maintain patient anonymity during that process. We've got to also be very transparent about the quality and the pharmacovigilance or the safety of that product. So if there's any reports about safety, anything like that, we need to go back to the regulatory authorities. We need to highlight that. And there's also a lot of rules about distribution and traceability of drugs and component parts of formulation within each drug that's produced, to be able to show that we can trace back to where those materials were produced. And this is all around patient safety. It's incredibly, incredibly important. And again, for the communications professional, we need to think about that promotional, non-promotional aspect to the compliance as well. So when it goes wrong for the pharma industry, it's a big deal. It can go horrendously wrong. So, oh, I'm sorry, I'm just going to stop here. Somebody's saying they can't see my slides. Is that the case for everybody? Should I try and maybe re-show them? Ah, okay, now people can see it. Okay, brilliant. Fantastic. Okay, thanks for letting me know. Okay, so if we think about, as I said, compliance, and when the pharma companies get it wrong, can be incredibly catastrophic financially for the pharma companies. So I've picked up 3 high-profile cases here where the FDA actually sued 3 very large big pharma companies back in the early 2009, 2013. So Eli Lilly faced a $1.42 billion fine for an antipsychotic that they'd been perceived as promoting for off-label use. So this was a psychotic drug that was used for, the label was for schizophrenia and bipolar disorders, but it was widely promoted by the sales team at the turn of the millennium for other neurological disorders, including sleep problems and dementia. So they received quite a substantial fine for doing that. Pfizer received one in 2009 as well, 2.3 billion this time for a painkiller. They were actually promoting it. It was an anti-inflammatory that has now actually been pulled from the market, but they were promoting it at a dose that was higher than the FDA had decided to approve due to safety concerns. So when the FDA realized that they were promoting it at a high toxic dose, they hit them with a fine of 2.3 billion. And Johnson & Johnson historically and famously got one of the largest fines we've ever seen, 2.2 billion for 2 drugs that they'd been paying physicians and pharmacists actually at the time to write prescriptions for. So that was a dementia treatment and a treatment for congestive heart failure. So I hope you can see that when you get it wrong, it can be catastrophic for the pharma company in terms of the amount of money they need to pay. And it's part of our role as communications professionals to be able to check that any information that's going out, because we write a lot of the sales team's information that's going out, we write a lot for the medical field teams as well, that information is within the label, it's promotional if it can, it's non-promotional if it needs to be, whether if it's promotional, again, it's within that label, it's within the right patient cohort. And we need to check and protect the pharma company from any of these kind of liability suits as best as we can. Okay, so I think that sets a good context of the kind of environment in which we operate in medical communications within pharma. Now I'd like to talk a little bit more about medical communications specifically and what it's like to work in medcoms. So first of all, I'm going to hit upon the culture. So when I first broke into this, I knew it was a service industry. Medical communications was providing a service to the pharma industry. And so I perceived that as maybe a power imbalance, that I would be, providing a service, they would be my client, some of those pharma people I was working with, and maybe that would provide some kind of power imbalance. But what I've come to learn is over the 5+ years that I've worked in this area, is that actually what we are is trusted advisors. We are consultants for these communications. We understand these compliance issues. We need to make sure that it's safe, that it's effective, that we're taking patient safety first. These are the important things that we bring, and that we also follow the compliance rules and that transparency, as I mentioned at the beginning, within the communications that we produce. So, for example, when we write a manuscript, we might collaborate with external academic clinicians to test the drugs, to look at them in clinical trials. And we want to interact with them and have them explain to us what works, what doesn't, any safety indications, and we have all of that recorded. And we know that process, we understand that as medical communications professionals, more than our clients who work within the pharma industry themselves. So we're positioned really as consultants for being able to deliver these medical communications in an effective and compliant manner. It's a very deadline-driven area to work in. It's deliverable focused. When a new product is coming through the pipeline and when it's being tested in the clinical trials, we set out, or the pharma industry set out, a strategic publication plan. They know at which point they're going to get interim data, which congress they're going to target with that interim data, which journal they're going to target. And then they know, of course, when the phase 3 trial is going to end, they will already have some interim data showing whether it's going to be effective or not, whether they'll go for FDA approval. And then they'll know they're going to target the Lancet or the New England Journal of Medicine. All this is planned out over a 5-year period usually. So we know as communications professional, we have that plan. We know what we need to deliver, and we know within the time frame that we need to deliver it. And you're very rarely working on one project. Mostly, I'd say you're working between 5 and 10 projects at any time as a medical communications writer. So you've got to track your time against each project. That was a really new thing for me coming from academia. I'd never tracked my time before against projects. So that's something you kind of have to get used to as well. It's a very detailed, focused industry. Quality, quality, quality. They're the 3 most important things. Absolutely paramount that what you write and what you deliver is high quality. You have to really care about the details. The levels of reviewing that we see in industry are incredible versus academia. I always remember being an academic and being able to write my slides the day before the presentation and being able to go and present them at a congress. That doesn't happen in industry. It's reviewed at many, many levels. And part of your job as a communications professional is to help your colleagues with reviewing, and it's also to do the project management around that reviewing process itself, where every single piece of data will be checked and double checked again and validated that it's absolutely accurate against the raw data that came off from the experiments that were carried out. You really have to care about those details. And it's a very collaborative environment to work in as well. I remember academia being quite, what's the word, siloed place, I guess, to work in terms of, you know, you'd have your research project, you'd work on your research project. Yes, you'd have your colleagues in the lab and you'd have your supervisor, but it was your project you were pretty much working on. In a medical communications environment, you're embedded within a team. You're within the writing team, and we support each other within the projects. We're reviewing each other's work. We're checking, we're bouncing ideas off each other. Then you've got account managers. These handle the project management aspects of the project as well. And then you've got medical editors who will read through and do all the kind of editing and formatting that you need for the writing. And we've got graphic designers as well. Lots of our slide decks, presentations at congresses, and materials around those kind of scientific events tend to be produced by the graphic designers, tend to make them pretty and beautify them for us. So all in all, you have to be able to work within the team. You have to be a very collaborative person to enjoy medical communications. What's the type of thing that we work on? Well, this is just a few of the things. Can be very varied work, actually. A large part of what we do, as I've mentioned before, is publications. So things you might be used to in academia, abstracts, posters, or presentations for congresses and manuscripts. But we also do a lot of scientific meetings, symposia, webinars, and advisory boards. Advisory boards are where the pharma industry will get specialists in. They will ask them specific questions. Could be, for example, doctors, healthcare professionals could ask them what in this particular therapeutic area, what are the patient needs? What's missing? What could we produce that would help in that area? So they gather that information, and they need a scientist within that room who understands that conversation, that can summarize all the main takeaway messages into a single succinct report, which is then sent around the pharma company later, and they can strategically think how to approach that particular scientific question. So our role, as I said, is to sit in those meetings and provide those reports. We do a lot of strategic publication planning, and I've mentioned that before. We also do a lot of medical affairs planning as well. So there's a lot of kind of strategy and business strategy about what we do and the work we do. We do a lot of training materials, both for the internal employees, so field medical, sales teams, but also external training materials as well. So if we want to educate physicians on maybe a new product that's entering into the market, we will produce training materials around that. May end up doing competitive intelligence work. So this is where you might be asked to go to a congress. You might be asked, what are the other competitors? Where are their products? What things are they bringing in? What questions are they looking at? And you'll have to compile all that, look at all that, and then compile all that into a report. We're doing a lot more interactive media these days. Even in the short time that I've been in the industry, this 5 years, I've seen it increase dramatically, of course, since everything's gone hybrid and more remote. We're doing a lot of podcasts. We're doing a lot of videos. Podcasts are an interesting one because what I'm finding is that now a lot of the journals want to podcast alongside a lot of the medical journals. And I think that's largely because people want to, rather than sit and read, a massive journal, they want a quick listen on the bus on the way to work, maybe the doctors before they go into clinic. They want to be able to listen to that information rather than have to sit and read a paper. So we're doing a lot more kind of interactive media as well. And patient engagement has become a really important thing as well in recent years. So we're producing materials that interact with patients and explain to patients what it is that our products can provide. And I think ultimately, again, that's largely because we've got this aging population, and people are interested in their own health later on into life. They want to know how they can have the best life they possibly can and what technologies are out there to help them. And I think that was really shown in the pandemic as well. There's a lot of information about how these vaccines work, how safe they are. There was a lot of conversations around that, and I can only see that increasing as we go forward. And then lastly, another big area that medical communications professionals can work in is translation. So typically most drugs are actually approved by the FDA initially. A lot of that work accesses the US market for most launch products, although that will be set to change going forward, I suspect. But then as the pharma company, which operates globally, wants to move its products into new geographical regions, those need to be translated into local languages. So there's a lot of work about translating a lot of these materials into those local languages. So what's the actual work like? Well, if you get into medical communications, as I said, most scientists will go in as a writer because the industry needs STEM professionals to help them understand the clinical data and write it up in clear, compelling messages. So you'd be right in thinking that a writer within medical communications would spend a lot of time writing copy, but that's only part of what you do. You do a lot of project management, as I talked about, that reviewing process. It's extensive. And you as the writer, lead writer on a particular project, will be project managing that reviewing process. Will be ensuring it's going to the right reviewers and those comments coming back are then taken into those documents. There's a lot of documentation, documenting things correctly, making sure those comments are again documented within the systems that we use, again for that transparent audit trail as needed. There's lots of meetings. We have status calls. We have calls about resourcing, who's going to work on what project. We have client meetings. There's lots and lots of meetings around trainings. So there's lots of chance to interact with colleagues, not just sitting and writing all the time. Client management is a big part of the job as well. Those soft skills of being able to interact with your client, understanding what their needs are, and then communicating those needs within the documents that you're producing. And then if you're working for a third-party vendor, like a medical communications agency, so you're not actually in-house in a pharma company, you'll be doing a lot of BD or business development as well. So you'll be thinking about maybe a client mentioned a new product in the pipeline. Is that something your company could provide support with? So there's a lot of, as I said, project management work around the actual writing. And then the other layer of things that you've got to think about as a medcoms professional is training. You've got to have therapeutic area knowledge. You've got to understand the disease setting in which you're writing. You need to understand the industry trends, how it's evolving, how it's changing. You've got to understand the compliance around communications. You've got to know the standard operating procedures that the pharmaceutical company uses for those communications. And you've got to understand those documenting systems as well that we use and all the other affiliated systems that we use on a daily basis. So there's a lot of training. You've got to keep up to date with that training continuously. Now, when you start off, when you first break in, you'll spend a lot of time doing the training because you've got to get up to speed with all this kind of compliance and this therapeutic area knowledge. Then as your career matures, you'll start doing a lot more writing. You'll be given more responsibility to writing more copy. But then as you develop further, maybe you'll take on some management positions, or you'll be looking after teams, as I am now. You'll do a lot more of the project management and reviewing junior writers' work. You'll be making sure that the clients are happy interacting with them. You'll be managing a lot of the meetings. So it's not a three-way split as necessarily shown here. It just depends on where you are within your career, where you'll be spending those time. What I've tried to do here is summarize what I think makes for a good medical writer. I think it's a scientist who enjoys reading and writing about science, who has good communication skills already, I think, and is particularly good at listening. That's a really important one. Communication is really all about listening. Who enjoys learning about science and is happy to learn new things. So it can be that 1 minute you're working on one therapeutic area, and then there's a need within the company to work on something completely different. And if you work as a freelancer, when I freelanced in 2020, on the same day I could be working on neurological disorders, then cancer in the afternoon, and then the following day could be working on dermatology. So, you know, the varied amounts of therapeutic areas you can work on are huge. But you've got to get up to speed quickly, and you've got to be interested in learning about science and healthcare and the new technologies that pharma companies are producing. You've got to have that eye for detail, as I mentioned before. You've got to really sweat the small stuff, check all the data. You've got to care as well about, you know, whether it's grammatically correct, whether some sentence structure is good enough, whether you could shave off a few words here or there, make it more clear, more concise. You've got to be comfortable with statistics. You don't have to do the statistics. There's always statisticians within the pharma company that will do those, but you've got to be able to interpret them. You've got to know what they mean, particularly within a clinical setting. You've got to be organized, right? As I mentioned, there's a lot of project management involved. You're managing this very extensive reviewing process, making sure that documents are going to the right people at the right time. So you've got to be very organized and keep on top of that. There's a creative element as well to the work. If you think about how the story flow is in what you're writing, how to make it engaging. We do a lot of slide decks. So how complex information is shown on a slide so it can stand out, so people can take the important take homes away from just looking quickly at the slide. There's a lot of, like I said, creative elements and aspects into the work. And as I mentioned before, you've got to be able to work well in a team. So who employs medical communications professionals? Well, medical communications agencies. These are third-party providers. These are external to the pharma company. There's a lot of them. Some of them tend to be very bespoke in the therapeutic areas in which they work. Others are a lot more broad. And they come in all different types. There's large ones and smaller ones, but they tend to mostly do the same thing, which is focusing on those communications around publications, events mostly, and some strategy work as well. Then the pharma, biotech, and medical devices companies, some of them also have in-house writers. Example is Novartis. Obviously, I work within Novartis itself, but Eli Lilly, Merck, Sanofi, they all have their own in-house communications as well. Some contract research organizations also employ medical communications professionals. So contract research organizations actually handle the clinical trials process for a lot of pharma companies. They are, again, a third-party provider of that externally to the pharma company. But as their clinical trials data come off, some of the larger ones, also have a subsidiary medical communications aspect to their business as well. So they can not only do the research for the pharma company, they can also disseminate some of the communication information around that research as well. And more recently, I've seen some non-profits and even government agencies offer medcoms roles. They tend not to be, the salaries tend not to be as high, but those non-profit charities that, oh, there seems to be a bit of background noise. Can you just turn off your mic, please? Thank you very much. Yeah, so I was just saying those non-profits, charities that fund clinical trials also seems to have now a need for medical communications professionals to be able to write up those trial data. And then I've mentioned a few times about freelancing. So self-employment is a big area that lots of people move into, particularly when they get to a senior level. They understand the compliance, they've got all the training, and they've got contacts within the medical communications industry itself and within the pharma industry. So they can get those high-paying contracts with those clients. And it just makes for more flexibility within your life. You can choose your hours you work, slightly higher pay than being employed directly. So lots and lots of writers eventually decide to move into self-employment. Okay, so let's just quickly look at the career paths. And sometimes it can be quite confusing when you're looking at jobs, if you're looking for specific writing jobs, what the career titles mean. So I've put 2 career paths on here. The top one is what they tend to use in the medical communications agencies. The bottom one is what the pharma industry tends to use. So if you see these types of titles on job adverts, associate medical writer or graduate scientific writer, they tend to mean the same thing. It's just that they'll be advertised presumably by a medcoms agency or a pharma company. So in a medical communications agency, you would start off as an associate medical writer. After a year or 2, you would progress into being a medical writer. And then another year or 2, you get to a senior level. So you can rise quite rapidly within medcoms agency. And eventually, as you become more experienced again, you'll move into principal medical writer. These 2 positions here, this one particularly is very well paid in agencies, very lucrative. And it's at this point that many people decide to move out and freelance if they want to. In a pharma company, you would typically start as a graduate scientific writer. Then maybe with a PhD, you could start at this level as scientific writer 1, or even I've seen people come in at scientific writer 2 as well. But very rarely, actually. Mostly, you would need to come in at scientific writer 1 with a PhD. Without a PhD, you probably have to come in at graduate scientific writer level. And then again, you would progress into what Novartis term an expert scientific writer, which is equivalent to a principal medical writer. Now, at that point, once you reach these heady heights, you can decide what you want to do. And you can either become a specialist and really become a therapeutic area knowledge specialist, so specializing in a particular disease type or a particular drug or brand. Or I've even seen people specialize in, say, patient materials. So you can become that specialist, that go-to person for that kind of information. Or you can become a bit more of a generalist. Maybe you want to expand your skills. Maybe you want to move into a different area of pharma, move away from medical communications potentially. And then it's best if you get more generic skills and you move into kind of general management of people. You start to understand budgets, leadership skills, these types of things. So there's usually tends to be a choice at this point of your career, what you want to do next. Okay, so let's just quickly brush over the recruitment process. It's largely like the recruitment process for most industry positions. You would submit an application, your CV or resume and your cover letter. You would then go to a screening interview, usually with an HR professional. And then if you pass that, you would be handed over to the hiring manager who would give you an interview. Now, the difference with a writing position versus other positions in industry is it will 99% of the time include a writing test. Now, I've put an asterisk here because actually this writing test, I've been for jobs at different companies. Sometimes they put it right at the beginning of the recruitment process, but most, I would say, put them at the end. And the reason is, and it's a good thing, that they want to know that they want you. The hiring manager wants you and will ask you for the writing test after that point, but not always. And I prefer it if they put it after the interview, because if they put it at the beginning, it can be quite a time investment to go through and do that writing test. It can take a day or 2. And then if they decide they didn't want you during the interview itself, then you spent a lot of time. At least this way, I've put it, they would know whether they want you or not and then ask for the writing test. But it completely depends on the employer. And then very large companies may also have an assessment centre. I know, for example, Novartis in India run an assessment centre for access into medical communications. Okay, so that summarizes the recruitment process. I just wanted to give you a few tips as well on your application, should this be something you're interested in moving into. So I think it really helps if you can demonstrate a breadth of writing skill. So you've got to have your scientific writing skills, obviously, but if you can show any other sort of writing at all for any other kind of audience, because as you can see at the beginning, I said we communicate to a variety of stakeholders in healthcare, from patients or the general public through to high-level experts in particular medical fields. And we've got to be able to write across that full spectrum. So if you can demonstrate a breadth of writing skill, maybe you've written a blog post, or you've written on social media, or you've written an opinion piece in a magazine or a medical journal, all those things will help if you can add those into your application as well. If you can get any kind of expertise, any kind of exposure to organising conferences or meetings, as I said, scientific meetings are a large part of what we do in medcoms, that can also help. And I would say if you're attending any committees, so perhaps you do something, student committee at the university, just ask if you can sit and minute the notes, because even just being able to put that in would be very similar, have some similarities to what we do, say, for an advisory board. And then read clinical research and understand clinical research. When I broke into the industry, I decided to go and do an online course on clinical trial research and setup of clinical trials, because the research that we were doing was very basic, and I felt like I didn't know enough about the clinical research process. And I started to read a lot more Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine papers as well, to try and understand what those phase 3 trials looked like, and what data within those trials looked like as well, in terms of the safety and the efficacy data. So getting to grips with clinical research will really help as well. And then get good with Microsoft Office as well. So all of the suite. So Excel, learn how to do pivot tables, PowerPoint, learn how to use the slide master and get your template set. Word, learn all the shortcuts in Word. Those things will really help as well. And then specifically for medcoms, try and get some familiarity with the industry standards. So the typical industry standards we use for publications are Good Publication Practice 3 and the ICMJE recommendations for publications. Those two are critical, and they will likely come up in any interview, or they would ask you what are the industry standards. If you can reel those off, it would really impress. Just to point out, GPP3 is at least 6 years old now, and we are expecting GPP4 to be published at any moment. So that good publication practice could change within a matter of days, maybe weeks. Well, we'll just have to see when we're expecting it this year, GPP4. So just if you're interested in this, keep a lookout. And then there are a lot of guidelines as well around how particular clinical research is shown. So Consort, for example, is an important guideline for clinical trials data, but there's lots around real world evidence and other types of clinical studies that might be going on. And a good place to look at that is the equatornetwork.org. I could actually put that in the chat afterwards, but that kind of summarizes all those guidelines. And I'm not saying you need to know all this, you just have to have familiarity with those industry standards that we use. And then the key thing is talk to medical and scientific writers who are working. You know, get on LinkedIn, find those people, network, learn what they did. That's how I got into this industry. I understood what they needed, so I understood their challenges, I understood what they did on a daily basis, and I was able to talk about that in an interview. And I think that showed that I was a credible candidate, essentially, for those jobs. So the more medical and scientific writers you can talk to, the better. And coming to events like this so you can understand what the job entails will also help you no end. It's also a great website, firstmedcomsjob.com. That's a fantastic resource. Lots of information on there about how to break into the industry as well. And then if you want to spend a bit of money, you could join one of the medical writing associations. AMWA and EMWA are the two big ones, the American Medical Writers Association and the European Medical Writers Association, but they're fairly expensive. But again, it's something additional to put on your CV if you want to think about it. And some people are fortunate to find medcoms internships, although they are very, very few and far between. So you could have a look out for some of those as well. Okay, so I just thought I'd quickly mention about writing tests, because when I first heard that there would be a writing test involved to break into this industry, I was a bit phased because I didn't know I didn't really have a clue about what it would involve at all. So I thought I'd just quickly highlight what you could be asked to do in a writing test typically. I'd say the most common by far is they will give you some data, clinical data, and they'll ask you to write an abstract, but you also might have to write a headline or introduction or summary around that. The difference between the summary and the abstract is that the abstract would be written, it would always have the data, the key data written within it numerically. So you would always put the efficacy and the safety data, the two main key pieces of data from whatever information they've given you, be it tables or paper figures, you would put those two key pieces within the abstract. In a summary, you don't have to do that. You can just summarize the main key points. You may also be asked to do a slide deck, and you may be given a copy editing test as well. So in terms of the copy editing test, they will say, here's a short abstract, say a short piece of writing, highlight with in a red pen where the mistakes are. A slide deck is basically just a PowerPoint presentation, but again, they will want you to pull out the key scientific information, and they'll also want you to make that slide deck look visually appealing. So I do all the marking at the minute in Novartis for our new hires on their writing tests. And these are the key things that I'm looking for. I'm looking to pick out the correct clinical data. That's an absolute must, has to be correct. They have to pick out the key things. That's why I said to you before, it's very important that you understand and you read about clinical research so you understand, you know, what the stats are showing, what to pick out. I'm also looking for mistakes. So attention to detail is critical because, as I said, this is an attention to detail job. We want folks that really care about the details. So any mistakes at all that I can see, you know, that's a red cross against. So do double check your work, do QC your work when you finished it before you submit your test. And then added bonuses as well. If anybody's gone away and done a bit of research, not hugely extensive, but particularly around the clinical trial itself. Say you've been given a clinical trial and then they've asked you to summarize on a slide, you know, the key information. If anyone's gone away and then looked at other pivotal clinical trials that went on around that drug and added that in, that was out with the data that we gave them, that's a bonus mark. And then again, thinking about the creativity, thinking about how those take homes can be shown in a nice way on a slide, it is a really useful thing to do. And when I say creativity as well, I'm thinking about story flow within an abstract or within a piece of writing. So those, I guess, are the four key things that we're looking for in a writing test. And then just, I want to leave you with a few key points about medical communications because, you know, it's a growing area. And I said there's a shortage of skilled senior writers. We need you. Lots of senior writers that we have either go freelance or eventually they might move on into other areas of pharma. And it's a growing area, there's a growing need for more communications professionals. So we're always trying to refill the ranks of senior writers, and we need skilled scientists, talented scientists to move into that. If you are going to make the switch, and this is general beyond medical communications, if you're going to make the switch from academia to industry, it's a career change. And so treat it like that. It's not just a job search. You know, you need to research the area you want to move into. You need to make yourself sound like a credible candidate. Not necessarily easy, but it's achievable with a bit of research behind it. So, you know, I would encourage you to take on some of those tips that I gave you. You know, think about those things like the guidelines, learning about clinical research, talking to medical writers. That will really set you apart from other candidates. And don't get disheartened by knockbacks. You know, I've heard people say, oh, I did a medical writing test and I didn't pass and I didn't get hired, so I'm obviously not going to be a good medical writer. How you write a writing test when you're breaking into the industry bears absolutely no resemblance on how you would be as a trained medcoms professional. You know, you have absolutely no training when you're trying to break into this industry. So do not worry if you don't pass your first 2, 3, 4, 5 tests. Just keep going. you will get better, and eventually you will get there. So as I said, there's no resemblance on that trained medcoms professional you can become. Don't let it put you off moving in. And then once you're in, there are absolutely tons of opportunities within industry. As I said, moving into a growing industry like this, it's just been phenomenal compared with my previous academic career, where I had like one option, which was, get to a PI level and then stay as a PI, maybe moving within academic institutions. But within the industry and within the pharma industry, there are so many opportunities open to you. I think it was 6 months. I was 6 months into my first position, and I had a headhunter approach me on LinkedIn asking me if I wanted to change companies within 6 months. That's how much demand there is for professionals within this area. So there are always opportunities open. And as I said, once you're in the pharma industry itself, there's opportunities to move elsewhere. You've just got to be very proactive and make strategic decisions around your career. Okay, so I hope that leaves you with a good understanding of what medical communications is, and what it's like to work in that area, and some tips on how to break in, and also a little bit of more understanding around what it's like to work in pharma as well. So if you're interested, if you got to the end of this talk and you're thinking, yeah, it's something that I'm particularly interested in, do think about signing up to my blog, because I talk a lot about this, particularly breaking into medical and scientific writing for scientists. I also talk a lot about working in pharma as well. So if you want to learn more, as I said, do consider signing up for that. But I want to leave you really with a final thought, because I was discussing this with someone the other day, actually. People often ask me what I do for a living, and the answer I give is that, I work for a pharma company and I write communications materials around our oncology drugs. That's exactly what I do. But actually, when I think about a little bit more deeper about what it is, the value of what I produce every day in society, what I get out of bed for, and I do. When I think about that more deeply, I think about those cancer patients. I help provide hope to those cancer patients with the work that I do at Novartis. And, I can go beyond that. I give people a future back. A cancer patient who can access one of our drugs that extends their lives or leads to a cure, I give them their future back, and I keep families together. And I know that sounds very deep, but I know for a fact that if my team weren't communicating the value of our oncology portfolio to the stakeholders that matter in healthcare, I know those life-saving medicines would not make it to the patients that need them. And that's what gets me out of bed in the morning, and that really excites me. So if that sounds like something that perhaps might excite you too, do think about this career, because, as I said, there's lots of options, and it can give you lots and lots of flexibility in your career as well. Okay, I think I'm going to finish there. And I saw a few questions pop up, so I am happy to take questions at this point. Would you like me just to go through the list, or would anybody like to come off mute and ask their questions directly? I'm happy to have a discussion or a chat. Okay, maybe I'll just start by going through the actual chat then.
Hi, Vicky.
Oh, hi, sorry.
Hello. Hi, my name is Suchita.
Hi.
Hi, thank you for the great talk, and thanks so much for all the information. I'm very grateful. I had a question. Do you think there's any scope for a person to enter medcoms field, maybe through a job or something, when they don't have a PhD with a master of life science related subject?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I said a PhD because I knew I was talking to researchers. Lots of people do have PhDs, and some don't. In fact, when I first broke into the industry, my first manager, she didn't have a PhD. I think she had a master's. She was honestly one of the best medical writers I've ever worked with. So it bears no resemblance. A PhD bears no resemblance to the medcoms professional you can be once you break in. The only thing I would say is that a PhD, I think the reason people are interested in hiring folks with PhDs is because it shows a degree of resilience, in as much as lots of PhDs have to work through projects that are tough and difficult. Sometimes as medical communications professionals, we have to work through projects that are tough and difficult. So I think there's an interest there in hiring PhDs, but it's not exclusively to PhDs, and there are plenty of people coming in with bachelor level, master's level into this industry. So it tends to be spoken about in PhD career forums, but it's not just for folks with PhDs, definitely not. Does that answer your question okay?
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Anything else? I can go back to the chat and have a look here, because there are a few popped in. I have a question about the publications. Okay, this is from Wumi. Oh, sorry, it's just flicked off. Bear with me. So Wumi's asking, are you an author of the publications you publish on behalf of the pharma company? No, you're not. And the reason is that the GPP3 guidelines, so if you read those, the good publication guidelines state that to be an author, you need to have had some input into the scientific development of the work. So as writers, we come in very much at the late stage once the data is produced. So we write up from the clinical trial data what the work is. That doesn't qualify us for authorship. We merely do the publication side of things and the submission side of those publications. Now, you do have to be acknowledged, so you will always be acknowledged as providing medical writing support for those, but you do not qualify as an author because you haven't worked on the research that goes into it. Now, I mean, as an academic, you know, that sounds, I guess, kind of odd, because in academia, of course, you've done the research, you write the papers, and those papers matter. It really doesn't matter in the pharma industry how many publications you have. It doesn't matter at all. So nobody will ever ask you before you break into the industry how many publications you have. They might ask you if you've got experience with writing publications, but they would never ask you how many you have, because it's totally irrelevant, because we are not authors. It's not one of our key performance indicators. It's not anything that we're measured against. So yeah, that answers that question, I think. There's a couple more. What are some good resources that can help develop skills for medical communication professionals for people who are not native English speakers? Well, the first answer there is there's a lot of people who are not native English speakers that have very successful careers in medical communications. And I think a large part to do with that is that we use editors. And I, as a native English speaker, actually rely on the editors quite heavily to improve my writing. They understand like basic things about how to structure sentences that make them more clear, when to use a hyphen versus when to use an end dash, basic things about grammar and English that, you know, are beyond my knowledge set. So even I benefit from them as a native English speaker, but what that means is that you can break into this industry. You don't have to worry about kind of that level of grammatical detail. You will be fine in this industry, provided you can write in English coherently. There's no issue why you couldn't work in medcoms. In terms of resources specifically that can help you develop those skills, I don't know any specific for medical communications, but you can certainly take some grammar courses, for example. If you want to get specifically into translation, because, you know, obviously if you're multilingual, if you're not a native English speaker, that is an area open to you that again could be very lucrative, could be very successful in that area of translation within medical communications. Specific translational courses are very helpful for breaking into that part of the industry. So I would say don't worry about it if you're not a native English speaker. Don't let it put you off that you can't work in this area. I'd say 50% of my colleagues are not native English speakers, and they're fantastic medical writers. So don't let it put you off. Just go for it. How can a microbiologist join medical communications? A microbiologist has plenty of the skills necessary to be successful in medical communications. Usually, a lot of adverts will say for an associate medical writer, they're after somebody with a life science background or some understanding of life sciences generally. And that's just largely because they know then that you're going to understand data. They know that you might have some interest potentially in diseases and disease therapies. So that tends to be why they ask for life science background. But really, any STEM background is sufficient to get into medical communications, provided you have an interest in clinical research. So I've worked with people who have come from a variety of different backgrounds, actually. I've worked with people who came from physics. I've worked with somebody who had an economics degree. I've worked with people who come from ecology, so nothing to do with medicine, particularly as a life science background. It's nothing to do with medicine. So yeah, I think a STEM background is what you need, and the microbiologist has that, so there's absolutely no issues with that. Let me just have a look. Some of these more questions are popping in the chat here. What would a normal day workload look like? Is it 9 to 5, schedule applicable most days? How is the personal and professional balance like? Okay, this is an interesting question. I would say it depends. So it depends on the company. You've got to be very careful about the company you go to work for. So I've heard horror stories of where people have felt like they had to work very late in the evenings. I personally have never experienced that. My workload in medical communications has been tough at times, particularly around Congress submission times. There may have been a couple of extended days where I've worked, say, until 7 o'clock in the evening rather than finished at 5. But they tend to be 1 or 2 weeks a year at most. I've never had it where I've had to work all through the evening or all through the weekends, or felt compelled that I needed to do that. And that's contrary to my academic experience, where I was working most weekends in the lab. So that's been a bonus for me. Those 50+ hour weeks are largely a thing of the past. I don't really have those anymore. That's not to say there aren't crunch times when it becomes very busy, but I personally have been able to keep that balance. I've been picky about the employers that I've worked for. Novartis is very supportive around work-life balance. That was part of the attraction for coming to a company like that. And the agencies I picked as well, I was making sure that they were those agencies. And you don't have to work in the medical communications industry for long to understand those agencies that really are putting on their workers. And the bottom line is people just don't stay there, and they move out. Now, if you want more flexibility than the 9 to 5, and I'd said once you get to a senior writer level, you can work for yourself. And when I was freelancing, I pretty much learned that I could earn as much in 3 days as I did in 5. That's the markup you can basically put on your time as a freelancer. So that gives a lot more flexibility, and that really works well for working parents. If you've got young children, being able to work like that around that kind of flexibility. And when I say flexibility, I mean as well flexibility in terms of being able to work remotely as well. I mean, I was working 1 day a week, so I had a hybrid role long before the pandemic when I was working in medical communications. Medical communications was already set up as a flexible hybrid working environment. So, that gave me flexibility as well. So personally, the workload and being able to balance it against my life has been a lot better in my experience in medical communications than it ever was in academia. But do be careful, because I have heard stories about people that have not had such a good balance and experiences at particular agencies. But as I said, you would get to know those pretty quickly. Medcoms is a really small world, and writers talk to one another. So you'd be able to figure that out pretty quickly. Okay, I have completed my PhD in 2019 due to some personal reasons. I couldn't continue with work in research fields, as now I have 3-year gap in my career. How can I plan my career in scientific writing? Well, that's not an issue. You have your PhD. I guess the key thing there is to just be honest about those 3 years in your CV, and then also, and this is true for anyone trying to break into the industry, write a very strong cover letter about your interests in getting into this area of scientific writing or medical communications, and really give that background for what interests you, why you want to break into that, and why you're moving away from a research career into a communications career. That's important. That's key for anybody breaking into this area. Your cover letter is incredibly important in explaining that. And in terms of a gap, any sort of a career gap, just be straight up with about it in your CV or resume, and then, you know, explain, maybe use that time you developed some skills. I don't know, maybe you can explain something that you did in that year, you learned something new, maybe you discovered in that time that you enjoyed communications. You know, maybe I don't know exactly your experience, but if you can think a bit creatively around explaining that gap, then you won't have an issue. I have completed my bachelor in biotechnology. Am I eligible for medical communications? Yeah, definitely. I think I covered that before. If you've got a STEM background, you don't need a PhD, you don't need a postgraduate qualification necessarily. You can still break into this area. How can an environmental health student join a medical communications field? Again, I don't think environmental health is an issue. I think you would be fine as well. For anybody, as I said before, thinking about breaking into it, who hasn't got that kind of clinical research understanding, and I include myself into that. I was working in cancer research in the lab, but I didn't have strong clinical research understanding. Do try and plug that gap. Do read about clinical research. Do some courses if you feel you need it to understand the statistics around the data. And also it will give you a good indication as to whether or not you enjoy reading this sort of stuff, whether or not you want to work in that area. So definitely, I mean, I see it open to everybody, but just do think about that clinical research knowledge gap that you may or may not have. Can we publish our research paper or article even if we've not completed our graduation at present? Do you mean, sorry, Melanie, maybe you want to come off mute because I'm not sure I fully understand your question, but are you asking if you took a job in medical communications, could you go back and publish your papers that are outstanding from academia? If that is the question, there's absolutely no problem. I was still publishing papers when I broke into the industry. As I said, I ran a lab. I had research students who were still working in the lab, and I was helping them write up their papers. So it's completely a separate thing. There's no worry about submitting in another area, in another field. Would you advise one to go into freelancing without having worked in medcoms? Okay, so I mean, it's a difficult one because I've seen people who've done it. I've seen people who've started freelancing and are working as freelancers medcoms, having never worked in an agency or pharma company. Now, I don't know how successful those people are. I don't know how much trouble or difficulties or struggles they have with getting high-paying clients. But all I can say is that when I freelanced, I'd been 3 years in the industry. I had a good understanding. I certainly understood the compliance. I had worked solely actually in oncology, but when I freelanced, I worked in a variety of different areas, as I mentioned in the talk. So I had to get up to date with those, I had to get up to speed with those therapeutic areas. But I think the key thing was that I took away from my medcoms experience before was the contacts, those high-paying contacts in agency and pharma companies that I would not have had I just come straight out of academia. And I think that's the key. I think you could do it, but I very much doubt you would get the highest paying clients. So I had a very high paying job with Sanofi that basically one project funded my entire year. And I know if I hadn't had medical communications experience in a medcoms agency, I wouldn't have got that project. So yes, you may be able to do it. Whether or not you can get the highest paying clients, I don't know. I don't know. I'd like to talk to somebody actually who's done that successfully and see how they manage. I guess over time you would, by trial and error, learn the compliance. But I don't know how you'd get access to that kind of information and that training. I think it would be a very difficult uphill struggle initially. What other questions have we got? What courses did I do to learn about clinical research? Yeah, that's an interesting one. So the one I did actually doesn't exist anymore, because I was looking for it the other day because somebody was asking me the same question. It was an online free MOOC, and it was offered by Yale University. But there's absolutely tons. All you've got to do is Google, literally Google, understanding clinical trials, or course around clinical trial research. And then there's others now. There's more. There's like real world evidence, phase 4 studies. So phase 4 happens after you've launched the product, and it's gathering all that kind of information around, you know, how the product is working in the marketplace, and designing smaller trials around, you know, the product in the real world space. So yeah, so you can, there's more courses out there than there were when I was looking when I was breaking into this industry 6-7 years ago. So definitely just be a Google search. Lots of them are free. You can sign up, you can do them in your own time, and it will just give you that kind of background information, if you like, into clinical research. As I said, I think I said in the talk, it will probably give you too much information. It goes a little bit too much into depth of the statistics around, say, randomization of a trial, things like that, because they really tend to be focused on people who are designing trials or want to get into clinical research specifically. So that tends to give a little bit extra detail than we need as medical communications professionals, because literally all we need to be able to do is look at the data, understand the statistics, and take away those key messages for whatever publication or congress materials or training materials, whatever it is we're writing. And we also need to understand the trial design and how the trial was set up, and some of the caveats around the trial. But we don't need to understand, you know, how the statistics was done specifically, how the randomization was done in great detail. So you might find some of the courses give a lot more detail than you need, but I mean, that's only beneficial to your learning, right? It's better to know more than less. So I would definitely look out for some of those, and a lot of them, as I said, those massive online, those MOOC courses given by some of the largest universities in the US are particularly good. Do I have time to answer any more questions? So this question is posed at the organisers. I've seen some people have dropped off, but I'm happy to stay on and answer more if people would like me to.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your insight into this most important topic. Now, it looks like we have covered many of our questions. So I request Aragyadeep Das, sir, to propose the vote of thanks. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Okay.
Am I audible? Okay.
Yeah.
Very
Yes, sir.
good evening to one and all, and very good afternoon to Dr. Victoria. And my heartfelt thanks to our eminent guest speaker, Dr. Victoria Seru. And at first, I thank you for accepting my invitation for the interactive talk cum webinar. And it was a really interactive career guidance talk from a great woman scientist. And you know, ma'am, the topic of your collection is so useful for students and researchers community nowadays. Actually, day by day, increasing in chronic disease, increasing in population, lot of side factors may force pharmaceuticals and healthcare industry to robust their skills for approval and consultancy and promotion their new products. And you know, now in India, day by day, career of medical communications and writings increasing and providing new freshers for ample opportunities. And the main important thing is that you share your knowledge in this topic was so impressive. And in 1 hour talk, we will give insight knowledge in very concise way. It was a remarkable and miraculous experience. Literally, I was enjoying it a lot, and learn a lot of things from you. and it also helps me to boost up the knowledge, and I hope all are liking it too. So ma'am, thank you for sparing your precious time and sharing your valuable knowledge with us, and big thank you for answering all the questions and interact with our body students and researchers. So it was a great experience, and thank you so much. And it's give me a immense pleasure to deliver a vote of thanks to our today's eminent guest speaker, Dr. Victoria Sherwood, and also all the participants. Once again, I thank you for such an interesting talk. We are really thankful to you for sharing your expertise, views with students, and your research career for it's so fascinating. And I'm sure that you inspired a lot of students, and it was our privilege that you were presented interesting talk that enlightened our students community, and I'm damn sure that it's more worthwhile experience from for everyone to listen to you. And thank you once again for making more memorable, and I hope you will able to make your presence in future too, and we will so pleasure have you in between us, and I'm looking forward to collaborate you in future too. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Victoria. And now my heartfelt thanks to our organizer, event coordinator, Dr. Kavita Pal, Dr. Arpana Pariyar, Dr. Das, Dr. Ritu Chandel, and Ms. Somuju Bhargavi, and our organizer, Ms. Bharti Patnani, Ms. Ananya, Mr. Seyans. And a big thank you to Bharti for wonderful anchoring and fruitfully handling the whole session. Thank you so much. And once again, all my dear students and researchers, thank you for joining and invest your precious time listening the talk and support us. And last but not the least, on the behalf of Biosetup Lifesciences, I thank each and every person for contribution this webinar, a successful one. And I'm looking forward for arranging many such events. Thank you all. Have a good day. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for your time on Saturday, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you being here. For the participants, filling out the feedback form is mandatory for your certificates, as the link is connected to the document that possesses your certificates. The feedback link has been shared in the chat box. Please fill out the feedback form. Thanks again for joining us today, and we will see you next time.